Hi there. I'm sitting here, or in a sense, I'm sitting here with Dr. Colin Russo from Engaging Futures. He's been in the futures game for probably close on 2 decades now, or something like that. Colin, and we'll come to that in a moment. But let's say you're on in an elevator going to and you're going to be facilitating something, and you're going upstairs, and somebody's standing next to you, and you're telling them who you are. How do you explain yourself to somebody on the elevator?
Well, usually in the elevator there's some joke about, hey, see you at the top, you know, uh, and which I actually fondly remember having Serena Russo say to me
Yeah.
one time, way back in about 92, in an elevator in West End, and ironically, her building, she let me stay in her apartment, which was one floor down from hers. And I remember looking out, and it's looking over the back end of West End, over University of Queensland, over the Brisbane River,
Lovely view, yeah.
over to the hinterland of Brisbane. And it's just an amazing helicopter view of the world. And, you know, I think trying to explain where I've come from in terms of futures thinking, was really, it's almost like the beginning of the planet itself. It's kind of like, this great explosion of thinking that you go through when you're very young, and you think, how lucky am I to exist in this universe, and how small am I in in the whole scheme of things? And that first awakening positions us into a sense of, well, uh, you know, what is my purpose? How can I make a difference? How can I honor the people around me? Um, excuse me, Marcus. And the opportunity then is to, to either go into university and study something directly related to ecology,
Yeah.
uh, and the universe, and think about it. But for me, it was late 80s, around 86, 87, when I was really asking myself, well, what should I do when I go to university, to kind of think about that commitment that we have to our inner self, that we know we're a part of an amazing place. There's an amazing, there's thousands of years of history that have gotten us here.
Yeah.
Uh, do we think in terms of, do we set our mindset for greatness, to actually think to ourselves, we've got to be humble within this perspective and this great opportunity that we have. But how do we connect up into a world when what we're being told is that there are very many disruptions that are taking place? And the first one for me was climate change and greenhouse effect. And I remember the school teachers that I had at the time in the late 80s saying, this might be the most important or significant issue of your lifetime. And of course, what we've experienced recently, in terms of disruptions, is quite breathtaking, in terms of, not only COVID-19, but all of the extreme weather events that we knew were going to come out of climate change,
Yeah.
are actually unfolding. Not least, we could talk about Cyclone Alfred and its effects that, on the southeast Queensland community, and the shock that I think we're all in at having to use our future scenarios and say, well, look, the worst case scenario is that I'm sitting in the direct path of a freight train. Do I move?
Yeah.
Or do I stay here, batten down the hatches, and try and defend while a cyclone hovers for 24 hours overhead? Um, and it's kind of a metaphor for life. How do we position ourselves to avoid the worst, and get in position to look for the best case scenario, and then perhaps a third option, which might be the probable outcome, which is based on all of the systemic realities, but externalities that might influence us as we try to make our plans. But there's nothing wrong with aiming high. And so that
Mm.
was my initial perception of, where I thought I'd get into futures thinking, was asking all of these questions. Firstly, community consultation, which I did for 10 or 15
Long
years
time, yeah.
in the Department of Environment and Heritage, the Department of Mines and Energy, and then in Caloundra City Council, Gold Coast City Council, trying to connect up community
Yeah.
with government to try to, um, resolve some of these questions about climate and how does that affect our local way of life? How does that affect businesses? So it's always community, government, industry. How do these different sectors interact? And
Mm.
and again, so I play a very small role in the universe. How do I create something of significance if I think that life is very fleeting, given the expanse of history and what we know to be coming into the future? So those were my first thoughts about, well, how do you get into futures thinking?
That's true, and that's one hell of an elevator pitch, I have to tell you, Colin. If you're going up an elevator.
Absolutely. No, it's when you meditate and you go into your mind's eye, when you're at the top of that elevator and you go out and you look around the platform, you get deep into oneself and you start to ask these philosophical questions that do guide our futures.
Yeah,
Because the more we look into ourselves, the more we leverage our opportunities outwardly. We
yep,
actually direct
yep.
and align our internal our, hopes and opportunities with what the universe needs at the
Yeah, what
time.
I'm hearing is, in a sense that, and it's not hubris in think, I'm going to do this, but we're all playing part in some sort of cosmic agenda. That's the way, in my mind, reads what you're saying. That there is this kind of cosmic story, and of course, all of us little guys, we're all running around doing our little thing. But there's something else between or around, or maybe it's that sort of idea from Timothy Morton I mentioned to you before we started recording, where, here I am, but I'm also a species. I'm part of a species that is having these effects at another level. So, yeah, I think that's a really interesting idea, Colin.
And as you say that, it's that, being part of a species and having to coexist with so many others
Yeah,
that I know you are so good at, Marcus. And we should honour a lot of your work in this space and the ability to actually um, tap into our own personal metaphors about how we actually coexist in a world that is vastly different to the one we grew up in.
yeah,
What is our rudder for our future um, sense of
yeah,
identity and belonging, as the world is no doubt going to change even further. So we're
yes,
coexisting with all of these different, not only species, but races, people, cultures, and we are a multicultural society. But that's where it kind of takes me is all of these important futures questions are, why you kind of get into futures thinking to begin with. It's, well, you can always be on the avant-garde and the cutting edge and
yep.
thinking about what's coming, but you can also get a sense of the current framework where we are at the moment and what does it mean to me to be part of the society that I'm in.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's a really good point. Yeah, but let's jump back a moment. So, at some point, you go to uni, you study uh, some sort of environmental planning or something. Maybe it is that gets you into the work you were doing with Gold Coast Council, Caloundra, and everything there. Um, and at some point, you bump into futures as a thing that you can actually get your hands on and say, hey, this is actually going to extend my work in some way. How did that come about? What happened in your Colin Russo biography, or you can tell it as an autobiography, and that sort of sparked all of that? I think I know some of the answer, but I'd love to hear it from you.
I mean, having studied, I studied communication management and then went into the Department of Environment, talking to communities around Queensland air, noise, water, waste, and mines issue policies. And that's where I got immersed into environmental issues even further, wanting to be part of the Department of Environment and understanding government from Brisbane and Queen Street, Ann Street. And this question of at that stage, I was studying a master's degree, and it was with Tony Stevenson, and at QUT in Brisbane,
Yeah,
and that was 94, and I started to talk to Sahil Inayatullah about his work at that stage, and kept that going in my thinking for another maybe 10 years before we got an opportunity to really work together at the Gold Coast City Council on the Our Bold Future initiative. And it was an opportunity to think more broadly. Sahel would raise this question, you know, because often people would say, look, we're too busy to conduct a futures thinking project. And I would always, question that myself. Well, how do you actually make a change and make a difference if you don't actually stop and take a breath and think, well, what's the best way to spend the next 10 years, to think 10 years, to get outside of the 3 to 4 year time frame that political cycles represent? And our Bold Future was an opportunity to bring Sahel Iniatala in to start to train staff and talk about his key methodologies, including causal layered analysis, which was, litany systems, worldview, myth, metaphor, an opportunity to think more deeply in futures thinking. And with that project, he would ask, well, how do you, when are we not going to be too busy to conduct futures thinking? How do we get ahead of the time game? How do we recoup the time that we're going to be using in futures thinking by making better decisions today that will save us not only time, but money and the planet along with it, and improve our lives? And so with causal layered analysis, of course, being a great opportunity to explore one of the methods of futures thinking, it was then for me an opportunity to take Bold Future and that methodology and come and talk to you at USC to start thinking, well, what is a good way to reflect on that Bold Future project, that massive project that reached out to 330,000 people. It was the largest engagement in the history of the city. There were 10,000 forms of feedback, 1,000. We did 26 workshops around the city. And it was a wonderful opportunity to, it led to, there were major projects that came after it with Mayor Ron Clark at the helm that led into the great work and wonderful work that's continuing today with Mayor Tom Tate. But it was the unveiling of a lot of those key seed ideas that turned into the Commonwealth Games, that turned into light rail, the Health and Knowledge Precinct. And a whole lot of other projects along with it, including improving transport systems and rethinking what are the height limits of major buildings and so on. What's the environmental impact?
Yep.
Going to USC was an opportunity to reflect, well, how do I use futures thinking methods to influence governance outcomes going forward? How did it actually work so well at the Gold Coast? What were the key critical factors?
Yep.
And then for me, it was an exploration again of, well, the 6 pillars of futures thinking. How do I map the past, anticipate the future, time the major changes and cycles that we have in the world? How do we then deepen our thinking about possible scenarios and our preferred future? And then how do we transform? How do we actually, once we have a preferred future, how do we actually, in a planning sense, logistically plan for the preferred future, perhaps using backcasting? And with that, I, have often delved into this sort of corporate side of futures thinking as well, and not just corporate, but I remember working with the Deaf Queensland community, and they said, well, look, if we're going to think about the future, can we also bring the past? Can we not forget our past? And I thought, yeah, look, I've got a methodology that I'm experimenting with, and I call it at that stage the Unicity Futures Method. And the idea with that method, which I now call the Inclusive Futures Method, because no one knows what unicity means.
Unicity, there we go. There's the book.
Thanks so much.
Well done, Colin, on that one. Because you're actually, I don't need to ask questions. You're actually going where I was going to ask you. So keep going, and I'll just sort of happily listen.
Well, Marcus, yeah, absolutely. Thank you for holding that cover up, because it's a, I call it the Inclusive Futures Method, and it's a method that works so well with causal layered analysis, because in effect, if you're working around scenarios and you're thinking, well, and perhaps you want to keep the past as part of, you can then do some slight adaptive work as well, or you can use it in terms of how do you think much more creatively about a completely new preferred future. And that to me depends methodologically. If you're going to run a futures session, do you run your CLA to deepen the future, deepen the preferred future as it might be, and run that after scenarios when we've identified the preferred future? Or do we use CLA to what we now describe as its role is widening the future? And so we can begin widening the future before we do our scenarios, because at that point we haven't yet defined our preferred future. We're just unpacking the future. And this is so because there are those two roles of before scenarios and after scenarios, I find it's really good to have another method like the inclusive futures method, which takes CLA into a different direction. If you've unpacked the future of litany systems worldview myth metaphor, then you run your preferred future scenarios using a change progression scenario method, which might be no change, marginal change, adaptive change, and radical change. You might select your preferred future as adaptive change, and you might take that adaptive, preferred future into the next session using the inclusive futures method.
Yeah.
So with that, then you explore its phases, which are the unique uplift, trying to understand that unique purpose.
That's the book. Yeah.
Which is from the start of our conversation. How do you connect your personal inner self, your own personal inner thinking, if you're going to run it with inner self? But how do you, or in terms of the Deaf Queensland organisation, how do you reconnect the past, the beauty of what you've done, the uniqueness of what you do? And then you can ask, well, transformatively, is that the unique self that we want to see in 10 years' time? What might be our preferred future in that regard? And we can sort of deepen the future in that regard, that we can fine-tune our preferred adaptive future scenario. And then we move to the second phase, which would be universal interest in that unique uplift. Well, who is actually interested in that? And then we might ask, well, what is the difference between universal interest and worldviews? And in some ways, worldviews asks us, what are, say, the stakeholders' points of view? If we look at major political parties, we might say, well, what's the Green view coming up to the next election? What's the LNP, Liberal Party view? What is the Labor Party point of view? And those give us worldviews to some extent. And then I might ask, using universal interest phase, well, then what is of universal interest across all of those parties, across all of those worldviews? What is common? Do we come up with answers like universal healthcare? Do we come up with answers like, like we might see in the United Nations with its Universal Declaration of Human Rights? What are the universal commonalities that we might want to see into the future? So we can kind of work with CLA prior to scenarios and then deepen that future, the preferred future adaptive scenario, using those two phases. And the third phase is what are the unaligned factors in those two possibilities? And of course, finally, what are the uniting possibilities that we can work with? So by looking at the uniting possibilities, we can look at co-creatively, because of my initial community consultation background, I'm always interested in inclusion and community consultation. How do we take universal healthcare and look at, well, who are the partners in universal healthcare? Are we transforming from our past view on what our original underlying factors were to, well, what are our potential improvements? What works? Where does it work to be underlined? But where does it work to heal, or where does it work to change? How can we do that through our united possibilities layer or phases? Next phase of saying, well, how do you actually co-create a new future? And finally, look at a fifth phase, which is the inclusive synthesis of all of that information, and perhaps compare a summary of a CLA, a summary of inclusive futures, and then build a vision, then the policies, then the strategies, then the actions within that new preferred future, and of course backcast from there.
Yeah.
And that's a summation of the inclusive futures method.
Of the process. So it's a very holistic process, Colin. I think you've done a really great job, and the way you have instrumentalized it through various futures tools, techniques, and whatever. And to me, that's the exciting thing. So you're where you are now is a synthesis of so many different experiences and so on. And I think that's what we get out of these interviews, is this sense that everybody's on a unique journey, and there are certain elements, often aspirational, that are calling for us, that we're yearning to actually engage with in some deeper way, and that futures allows and enables that. And there's also this sense of a futures tribe. I know that you're very close to Sahel and you work a lot with him, and so we also have communities of belonging that I think are really important too. That and those can be. I often say to students, they don't have to be alive. You can feel a sense of community with, I don't know, Plato or someone from the deep past, and yet he's still part of your tribe. So to me, that's important, and I really appreciate the way you've been able to bring that together for the listeners, but for me too, because we don't often talk like this, do we? We don't often sit around and say, okay, how did you get where you got, and that sort of thing. What I'm turning now to ask you the crunching question is, well, what advice would you give to somebody getting into futures now? So we're in 2025, a lot of water's under the bridge. We got 50 to 80, 90 years of very specific futures type thinking that we're sort of harvesting and nurturing and taking forward. What would be your advice, Colin?
Well, look, come and speak to yourself, come and speak to Sahel people, other futurists. But the beauty that you bring, Marcus, is this, as we're seeing and experiencing this conversation, is this opportunity to listen, but unpack and explore and connect the inner self to what we're actually doing. Yep. and wind theory and philosophy into that. And so, but when you actually go and read the vast number of articles that you've actually written and look at at some of your images of yourself hiking in the Glasshouse Mountains, or looking at your Facebook posts about where you've connected into the East, going into Asia and exploring different philosophies. I was speaking to someone recently, a youth who was wanting to know, just starting off and studying philosophy, and he said, look, I'm just interested in creating my own methods. And I said, well, look, actually, people have lived their whole lives, and I'm 55, but he's 18, and I said to him, well, if you pick up a book and talk to a philosopher who's lived for decades, what you're going to learn from is the extraordinary experiences that they've surmised. And you can bind together a few of these books and bring all of that knowledge to your life and make your life more purposeful. And so initially what we need to do is read and get engaged, but have a philosophy as to why we're reading other people's work, why we should contact Marcus Bussey. And not only can they slingshot you into the future, but they can actually be your mentors and your guides and your real daily heroes. The people that you say, well, what would Marcus think if he was solving this problem? Because he's going to bring a particular worldview. What would Sahel say if he was going to do this from a different Eastern perspective? And how would Marcus bring those two perspectives together? What role do futures thinking methods have in the day-to-day that I can then synthesize some of this feedback and use it in my daily practice? Because one thing that we've found is that it's all too easy for 10 years to slip away in the office and for people to just live the day-to-day, always thinking that they're going to change their personal futures or make a difference. And what they really need to do to disrupt the day-to-day is to use a transformative futures method, because that's what they're designed to do. We're all interested in I always talk about those 10 systems. So social inclusion, economic reform or legislative reform, environmental sustainability, culturalism, technology, service industries, manufacturing organizations, education and sustainability.
Whole suite, yeah.
Yeah, so we need to think, and that's what Futures does. It imparts all of these systems and all of what I often talk about is the negative tipping points, but also the positive tipping points, the things that will build inertia such that we can create the most difference for a particular system or scenario that will actually create momentum that's positive, that's irreversible. So how do you actually create that? And so you can be sitting at your desk and actually apply a method, whether it be the futures triangle or CLA or inclusive futures method or backcasting or scenarios, and actually create a transformative framework for yourself if you really want to break out of just living the same way each day.
That's really interesting. So this kind of, having followed that arc, you've got get to know the foundational stuff, your philosophers that sort of come in and inform your value system, do the inner work where you're tapping into what's actually driving you, and then also engaging some form of transformative stuff which leads to action. Did I do that? Did I sort of grab those four elements? That's kind of what you're saying, Colin?
And then the fifth is, as you've been suggesting, is this kind of session that we're in now that the university and yourself bring. So it's your passion for futures thinking and humanity that actually makes it work. And that's what we've got to remember, is that it's not just the method, it's the person behind the method that's delivering the method. And it's their deep passion that we have to get in contact with. We have to support other futurists. We have to support consultants who are doing, wanting to do great work and understand their backstories. But it's then that system that you put in place through the university, Sunshine Coast, that reaches out and says, hey, come in, you're working on methods, come in and talk about it, and we'll offer you some, opportunities to think through it.
Expand that. That's brilliant. Thank you, Colin. Thank you very much. It's been a great conversation. I'll get you back if you don't mind. So I'll find the right button to click. I often click the wrong one.
Yes. Look, I really appreciate your warmth and having some empathy and opportunity to talk about futures, Marcus. So, because you're one of the world's best, and I really value the opportunity.
Thank you.